and by on Bonnie Brae, where the sun shines bright on Loch Lomond. There me and my true love spent many happy days on the bonny, bonny banks of Loch Lomond. Ye tack the high road, and I'll tack the low road, and I'll be in Scotland before ye. But me and my true love will never meet again on the bonny, bonny banks of Loch Lomond. 'Twas there that we parted in yon shady glen, on the steep, steep side of Ben Lomond, where in purple hue the Highland hills we view, while the moon coming out in the gloaming. Ye tack the high road, and I'll tack the low road, and I'll be in Scotland before ye. Me and my true love will never meet again on the bonny, bonny banks of Loch Lomond. The wee birdies sing, and the wild flowers spring. In the sunshine the waters are sleeping, but the broken heart, it cares nae the second spring, though the woeful may cease frae their greeting. Ye tack the high road, and I'll tack the low road, and I'll be in Scotland before ye. Me and my true love will never meet again on the bonny, bonny banks of Loch Lomond. Ye tack the high road, and I'll tack the low road, and I'll be in Scotland before ye. But me and my true love will never meet again on the bonny, bonny banks of Loch Lomond.
Hey, virtual Freiburg campers. This is Devin Zuber on the West Coast in California, and I'm so glad that I get a chance to do a mini course with all of you and be in conversation. I sure wish I could be in Maine this summer, back on the beautiful banks of the Saco, and to be in fellowship with all of you again, but here we are. So what extraordinary times we are living through. If you ever wanted to know what it was like to be alive during the Great Depression, the 1918 influenza pandemic, the stock market crash and economic turmoil of the Great Depression, the onset of popular authoritarian regimes in the 1930s. Well, here we are all at one go. And I'm wondering, how can our theology help us at a moment of such intense cultural division and dissension? Many historians have commented on how Americans have not been this so divided amongst ourselves since the time leading up to the Civil War in the middle of the 19th century. So how might our church's teachings about charity come to the fore as something significant for these times in a very pragmatic and practical sort of way? And for my time with you in this lecture conversation we'll have online, I want to take us on a little bit of a time travel trip back in time to the inception of our church movement in the first general conference that happened in England in 1789. The new church, when it appears at that moment, is also a time of enormous political and cultural turmoil, of revolution, with the fire and ashes of both the American and French revolutions fresh in the air of London when those first Swedenborgians met. It also was the inception of great anti-slavery struggles, the plague with quarantines, and also government crackdown and suppression of free speech and movement. So our church begins, one could say historically, at a moment of intense turmoil and upset. One of the attendees at that 1789 First General Conference, which launches the Swedenborgian church movement as we know it today, a movement and a conference that ended, we should note, with, after reading aloud the Articles of Faith, making repast to a tavern, to a pub there in Great Eastcheap in London. One person attending that event in 1789 was the great artist and poet William Blake. And I think that Blake can be useful and interesting, not just for art historians or literary critics like me, but also for Swedenborgians, because he came to wrestle and grapple with Swedenborgian theology and adapt it into his art in very interesting ways. And I've just come out of teaching an all Blake seminar this spring, 2020, which was really electrified by the turmoil that we went through as a class, not being able to meet in person due to COVID-19. And then as the summer months unrolled and the course came to an end, the onset of conversations about race and systemic inequity that the Black Lives Matter movement has brought to the fore. So Blake has been very fresh in my mind. And in light of Black Lives Matter and the great racial fissures in the United States that have been revealed and brought to consciousness from some for the first time, really a new awareness of deep systemic racial inequities. It's an apocalyptic time, right? In the sense of an unveiling, a revealing of things below the surface. I think spending time with Blake in these early days of the Swedenborgian Church is an instructive moment, because it's a time when Black lives were mattering in new ways through the prism of Swedenborgian theology. So before we go to Blake himself and a few poems from his Songs of Innocence and Experience that I want to do a close reading and conversation with all of you about, I want to briefly first make some remarks about Swedenborg and his essential teachings on charity, which is the third thematic for the Freiburg lectures about the essentials of the church. Now, it's really easy to think about doing charity and good to people who are like us, right? With whom we share similarities of belief or political opinions, who might look or appear similar to us. And on social media, with platforms like Facebook, things like the like button, where you can put a heart or a thumbs up, have certainly reinforced this sense that we give a sense of goodwill and nodding and an assent to things that are like us. But according to Swedenborg, this isn't the neighbor we are necessarily to love as ourselves. Swedenborg's teachings on charity are pretty radical in expanding who and what constitutes the neighbor. And works like the New Jerusalem and its Heavenly Doctrine, which I'm going to be reading from a little bit in a bit, but also in Swedenborg's last final big work, The True Christian Religion, which Blake knew in his day in the late 18th century as the Universal Theology. An alternative translation for Swedenborg's True Christianity for Blake was the Universal Theology, where Swedenborg also redefines the biblical concept of the neighbor. In fact, if we only view people who are like us as the neighbor deserving of charity and love, Swedenborg suggests that this can be actually rooted in an evil love of ourselves. And to give a sense of this, I'm going to read from a particular number from the New Jerusalem and its Heavenly Doctrine. This is number 89. People who are selfish acknowledge as their neighbor only those who love them most, that is, so far as they belong to themselves. These they embrace, they kiss them, they confer benefits on them, and they call them brothers. Yes, because these people are evil, they say, that these are the neighbor more than others. They esteem others as the neighbor only in proportion as they are loved by them, thus according to the quality and quantity of their love. Such persons derive the origin of neighbor from self, by reason that love constitutes and determines it. But they who do not love themselves more than others, as the case with all who belong to the kingdom of the Lord, will derive the origin of neighbor from God, whom they ought to love above all things, consequently from the Lord. And they will esteem everyone as a neighbor according to the quality of a person's love to the divine, and from it. So that's a very Latin, earlier translation of that passage from New Jerusalem and the Heavenly Doctrine. And just to sort of paraphrase, to underscore what Swedenborg is saying here, everyone and anyone is our neighbor, depending on the quality of their receiving the flow of love from the divine. Swedenborg gets more explicit in these numbers and creates a kind of web of interrelated responsibilities, a kind of ecology of neighbors that we are embedded in. We view as a neighbor the social people around us, what Swedenborg calls the society, but there is a higher level than that society, that is, the nation we belong to. Surpassing even the national sense of belonging and neighborliness is our spiritual community, the church, and above and beyond that, the divine itself. This is the highest degree of the neighbor to whom we are to be in charity towards. So rather than the neighbor being defined by our neighborhood or the social or national bonds we might have as citizens, or we might add on to that, of course, racial, a sense of neighborliness to those who happen to share our same skin color. Swedenborg spiritualizes this concept of the neighbor to something much broader, larger, and all-encompassing at its highest degree. Here is a little bit later in New Jerusalem and the Heavenly Doctrine. Here's number 95, which makes this even more explicit. The Lord's kingdom is the neighbor in a still higher and highest degree, for the Lord's kingdom consists of all who are in good, both those on the earths and those who are in the heavens. Thus, the Lord's kingdom is good with all its quality in the complex. When this is loved, the individuals are loved who are in the good. So, to sort of concretize these ideas, I now want to turn to William Blake and look at some images and pictures from his beautiful Songs of Innocence and Experience. And I'm arguing that some of Swedenborg's revisions of charity, his expanding it outward to categories beyond the ethnic, the social, the national, to something more universal, predicated on love, love to the divine, was something that catalyzed Blake and other early Swedenborgians, that helped them see beyond boundaries of race, and that in 18th century London, Black lives mattered. So now we turn to Blake.
And here we go. Here's a portrait of our man of the hour, William Blake, painted in 1809. And it characteristically shows Blake looking upwards towards heaven, the source of his visionary imagination and insight, as he felt to be in direct communication with the divine and with the angels and with his dead brother in particular. And in 1789, Blake and his wife Catherine had participated and signed the charter documents for the first Swedenborgian church movement in Great Eastcheap, London, as I've already mentioned. This is the only organization that Blake is known to have joined in his lifetime or signed his name to. So it was pretty significant. And it inaugurates a very rich creative period as Blake wrestles with Swedenborgian thought into the 1790s, perhaps culminating in one of his most famous works, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, from 1793. Any reader of Swedenborg will hear immediately perhaps an allusion to two of Swedenborg's more notorious works, Heaven and Hell, and also Conjugal Love, or Marriage Love. This is a satire, and as many critics argue, you really have to be intimately familiar with Swedenborg's writings to kind of get the inside jokes that Blake embeds into this work. It's interspersed with visionary content that Blake calls memorable fancies, which are an echo of Swedenborg's own interchapter content called Memorable Relations. And they're pitch-perfect parodies of Swedenborg's very rational disquisitions on his journeying through the spaces of heaven and hell and the spiritual world. So it was a book that was likely meant as kind of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge insider text that circulated in the group of early Swedenborgians in the 1790s. It's important again to remember that the inception of the church in 1789 was really at a moment of incredible change and transformation in the spiritual landscape of Western Europe, in London in particular. And Blake was one of many people who attended that event who claimed visionary insight to speak and communicate directly with angels. Also in attendance at that originary conference was a female prophetess, Dorothy Gott, who preached the word on her own. She was maybe the first female Swedenborgian minister, we could say, and also an entrepreneurial American phrenologist. So it was quite an eclectic group of spiritual seekers and free thinkers. With these books from the 1790s that Blake made that have Swedenborgian overtones, what are we looking at? Blake called his own idiosyncratic method of creating these texts illuminated engravings, which is kind of an oxymoron because illumination, an illuminated manuscript, recalls the way the medieval scriptorium produced by hand beautiful illuminated manuscripts that were washed with colors and very different from the method of engraving on a plate and producing with a press mass copies of something. So for each one of these books, Blake created with a copper plate an engraving that he then would go back over once the paper came out of the press with watercolor. Sometimes he melted gold or silver and other metals and layered them on the page like a medieval book of hours, say. So no book is like any other in Blake's cosmos. He produced varying quantities of these books over the duration of his life at various periods, and each one is singularly unique and contained. So it's both mass reproduced, like a modern book we order on Amazon and get from a printing press, print on demand, but it's also like the pre-modern form of bookmaking, which was done by hand, that made each copy singular and unique. Blake also felt like his method of bookmaking and engraving on a copper plate in a certain way was dictated to him by the spirit of his dead brother Robert, who came and spoke to him and told him how to do a very unique way of making copperplate engraving. Blake's most beloved and well-known work that we'll be spending our time together looking at and discussing are the songs of Innocence and Experience, which he made in this great Swedenborgian period between 1789 and 1893. Some have stipulated that these poems, which sound like songs, we know that Blake is known to have sung these to himself, and there's a rich history of subsequent artists, including Allen Ginsberg, who've set these poems to their own music on the harmonium and other instruments. Some have stipulated that this might have been in partial response to a call for new forms of liturgy and hymnody in the early nascent Swedenborgian church. There's two poems from Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience that I think are very relevant for thinking about Swedenborg's model of charity as being something that became opening out to the other, the religious other, the racial other, and as part of Blake's own encounter with blackness with Africans in London in the 1790s. One of these two poems is The Little Black Boy, which we're not going to discuss right now in great detail. We might turn to it later on in the discussion period that we have. As critics have pointed out, a crucial context for Blake's poem, which is about a little black boy who dies and goes to heaven and becomes friends with a little white boy. You can see them on the second plate here, kneeling at the feet of Jesus. One critical context behind this poem is certainly Blake's awareness of Karl Bernard Wadström, who was a crucial early abolitionist. He was Swedish, but he lived in London. He was part of the circle of Swedenborgians around the formation of the church in 1789. And Wadström had attempted to establish a colony for liberated free slaves in what is now today Sierra Leone. He actually brought freed slaves back to London. One of them was this fellow pictured here, Peter Panna, who was baptized along with Wadström into the Swedenborgian church. And it's very likely that Blake would have personally known this black boy and the man who had freed him and sort of adopted him as a son. This painting was made in 1789, and it hung in the Royal Academy, where Blake almost certainly would have seen it. Wadström was a well-known Swedish economist besides his abolitionist projects. He's a fascinating, complex, and ambivalent figure. I think it's important not to put him on a pedestal. Some of his romanticizations of Africa and the Africans were still drenched in a kind of racialism that's very important to contextualize. I don't have time to go into that right now, but I just want to cite and point out that my colleague at the Center for Swedenborgian Studies here in Berkeley, Jim Lawrence, was part of a conference that became a book about Wadström. And there's this fantastic collection of essays evaluating Wadström and his legacy and the discourse of abolitionism, his centrality to the later projects that Wilberforce and others picked up. The book is called The Moment Is Now, and the Swedenborg Foundation carries it along with other distributors like Amazon. Now, the poem I really want to sort of land on at the end of my little lecture before we move into a more free-form Q&A and discussion conversation is this other poem, The Divine Image, where I think we really can see Swedenborgian concepts of charity that became universalized and expanded outwards to encounter and incorporate religious and racial others. We can see this in operation. So I want to end my little very quick breakneck speed lecture on Blake with this poem. I'm going to read it out loud. You can see on the left is the poem as it appears in Blake's original illuminated engraving book from the Songs of Innocence and Experience. And I've given a transcription on the right, which is a little bit easier to read on the eyes. If any of you have seen Blake's books in person, you might have been shocked, as I was when I finally got a chance to see an original copy of the Songs of Innocence and Experience at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. They are so tiny. They emulate the size and scale of a medieval book of hours. And to really read the poem, it requires an intimacy with the text. You have to sort of hold it in your hands and put your face close to the page in order to scry the words. There's sort of a tenderness in the reading experience of Blake that's important to keep in mind. It's part of the aesthetics and the poetics of the text, that kind of physicality that's required to get into reading the poem. So this is the divine image, and we can hear Swedenborg distinctly when the poem incorporates into its phrasing the human form divine, which is in the third stanza. The human form divine. This comes right out of the Swedenborgian theology that Blake was reading at the time. So I'm going to read the poem, and we can let it sink in, and you can look at the accompanying images to the text on the left as I go through the words, and then we'll talk about it in light of the earlier discussion around Swedenborg's teachings on charity that expanded the concept of the neighbor outwards. The divine image. To mercy, pity, peace, and love, all pray in their distress, and to these virtues of delight return their thankfulness. For mercy, pity, peace, and love is God, our Father dear, and mercy, pity, peace, and love is man, his child and care. For mercy has a human heart, pity a human face, and love the human form divine, and peace the human dress. Then every man of every clime that prays in his distress, prays to the human form divine, love, mercy, pity, peace. And all must love the human form in heathen, Turk, or Jew. Where mercy, love, and pity dwell, their God is dwelling too.
Take the high road and I'll tack the low road, and I'll be in Scotland before ye. Me and my true love will never meet again on the bonny, bonny banks of Loch Lomond.